wondering if you ever noticed something just a little bit odd in the story of how God created the world in the opening chapter of Genesis. You see, in the opening chapter of Genesis, there is this formula that is repeated over and over again. Every time God does a major act of creation, it starts like this. The Bible says, and God said, let there be. And then God designates what he wants to happen, light, land, sky, whatever it is. Then it happens, and then the Bible sums it up by saying, and it was so. And this phrase, this set of phrases, is repeated over and over again if you read through the first chapter of Genesis. And it seems quite obvious that it's there to mark each significant act of creation. Each major act of creation by God is marked with this set of phrases. But the odd thing about that is, if that's what's going on in this passage, that means that in this opening chapter of Genesis, God actually creates 8 times. Because those phrases are repeated 8 times throughout the first chapter of Genesis. In other words, there are 8 very clearly marked, distinct acts of creation in the opening book of the Bible. So God creates light, sky, land, vegetation, sun, moon, and stars as one act, fish and the birds as another act, animals and people. Somehow I lost count there, but that adds up to 8. 8 distinct acts of creation. So, you could look at this opening chapter of the Bible and say, okay, let's call it the story of the 8 steps of creation. But we don't go with that. And of course, if each of these major acts of creations took one day, as most of them do, then it kind of leads you, it sets you up to expect that this is going to be a story of 8 days of creation, followed by a 9th day, the day of rest. It kind of is set up that way, but of course, that's not what the story is, and we all know that, because we all know that the story of creation, as it's told in Genesis, takes 7 days, 6 days and a day of rest. So what seems to have happened is that somebody, somewhere along the line, took a story of 8 steps of creation, 8 stages of creation, and crammed that story into 6 days. It's kind of like a rush job. And why I suspect that they did this quite intentionally. They knew exactly what they were doing here. And I think they did it, in fact, to make a very important point. The point they were making was this. This story, this creation story, as it's told here, is not really about how long it took. I don't think that the people who told this story to one another, the story that eventually got written down in the opening chapter of the Bible, really understood, really even cared how long it took to create everything. That's why I don't think it was ever about creation taking place in 6 24-hour days. It was about something else. The point of the story was about something other than how long it took. The point of the story was, of course, to tell these people who they were, and more importantly, where they fit into the universe. That's what the story was about for them. And that's why it mattered so much for them that the story was told in the cycle of days in which they lived their lives. The weekly cycle that ordered their lives. This story was telling them also was built into the very structure of the universe. Now, a lot of people look at this story in the opening chapter of the Bible and see a bit of a progression. God, as he creates, he sort of builds up. He starts with the lower animals and the vegetation, and he sort of builds up to a climax. And most people would assume, therefore, that the climax of the story of creation, as told in Genesis, happens on the 6th day. The second act of creation on the 6th day, the creation of human beings. Many people look at that and say, okay, that's what it's all about, creating people. They are the crown of creation. And a lot of people have taken from that the attitude, okay, therefore that means that human beings are more important than everybody else. More important than the animals and the other creatures that live on this planet. And that we don't have to think about how we need to take care of the animals are there to take care of us. That's the attitude that some have taken from this creation story. But I got to tell you, I believe that such an attitude completely misses the point of the story. The point of the story is that the climax comes not on the 6th day. The point of the story is that this is a 2nd-day story, intentionally told in such a way to make it come out and end on the 7th day. Therefore, the climax of the story comes on the 7th day. The story is all about the Sabbath. And the point of it being, I believe, that the idea, the need for Sabbath and Sabbath rest is something that is built into the very structure of the universe. That's what the story means. Strange idea when you think about it. I mean, most of us, when we think about the idea of Sabbath, we think of it as some sort of odd Jewish custom. We don't think of it as something that really has cosmic significance. But I believe that's what the Genesis story is saying. Why would anyone think of the Sabbath in such terms? Well, to understand that, we need to look closer to the idea of Sabbath as it was practiced by the ancient people of Israel. So let's take a look at the Sabbath law, one of the famous 10 commandments, as it comes to us in the book of Deuteronomy. The people of Israel in Deuteronomy are told to observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And they're also told why they are to do this. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So that kind of makes sense, of course. They were slaves, they were freed from slavery, and so they celebrated their freedom in a very appropriate way by not working 1 day a week. But the interesting thing I find about this commandment is it doesn't just leave it there. The commandment goes on from there to specify exactly who is to observe this Sabbath. And it's quite a list. The list of who has to celebrate the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath, includes you, yes, but also your son and your daughter, and your male and female slave, and your ox, and your donkey, any of your livestock, even the resident alien in your towns, the non-Jews. Everyone has to observe this Sabbath day. So the odd thing about this list is it basically lists everybody, every category of person in that society. And you gotta wonder, well, what's the point of that? Why have such an exhaustive list of who needs to participate in this Sabbath? Well, the reason I think is quite clear. The reason why that list is there is because God understands something really important about human nature. God understands that if anyone gets left off that list, guess what? They get to do all the work on Sabbath. I mean, think of it. If this list had included everybody in society except, for example, the female slaves, what would have happened? The Sabbath day would have been held for the female slaves. They would have done everything. Because you can be sure that the masters would not have been able to enjoy their rest without someone to wait on their every whim and desire. So the reason that everyone is listed is to make sure that no one is excluded. And when you understand that, you realize that this Sabbath law is about more than just mandating rest. There's something subversive about it. Because this Sabbath law actually demands a transformation of society. For one day of 7, everything's supposed to be different. For one day, there are no slaves. There are no male or female. There are no differences, even between people and animals. Everyone on this one day is absolutely on the same terms. Now, of course, they couldn't live in such radical equality every day as a society. Their entire society would have fallen apart. Their society depended on some people being more valuable than others. So what this Sabbath law was about doing it right one day a week. It was about living as a society the way that God intended for them to live. For it was God's will that there be no difference between male and female, slave and free, Jew and Gentile, human and animal. They couldn't live that way all the time. Their society would have fallen apart. But this law demanded that one day a week, they do it right, the way that God intended. But there's not just one Sabbath law for the ancient people of Israel. There's another one that's often neglected, but that in many ways was more important to them. And this was the Sabbath year law. Just as they had to count off every day and take the seventh one as a day of rest, they also needed to count off every year and take the seventh year as a Sabbath rest. And this one was different, of course, because it was a rest for the land. Now, if you're all familiar with the history of agriculture, this may sound a little bit familiar to you. Because you may know that even from ancient times, farmers came to understand something about the land that they lived off of. They came to understand that if they rotated their crops through different fields, they got a better yield. And even more important, they also learned that if every few years they left one of those fields alone, they didn't plow it, they didn't sow it, that also increased their productivity from that land a great deal. And so farmers, even from ancient time, had this practice of leaving fields to lie fallow. That's very similar to the Sabbath law, and that is indeed part of what it is about letting the agricultural land rest. But it's also about more than that. I mean, look closely at this law. The instructions for this year are very clear. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes on your unpruned vine. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. But it adds, you may eat what the land yields during the Sabbath. So what is produced naturally of itself, that you can eat. But the interesting thing is, it's not just you. The interesting thing is that this Sabbath law, just like the Sabbath day law, also goes on to list who actually gets the benefit of the produce of the land. And once again, the list is exhaustive. It's you, yes, but also your male and female slaves, your hired and your bound laborers who live with you, your livestock, and even, rather surprisingly, even the wild animals can benefit from what the land naturally produces. So once again, this list, I think, kind of changes the nature of the law. And what we begin to discover is that this law isn't just about giving the land a rest, it is also about who owns the land. Because what effectively happens during this seventh year is that if you own a piece of farmland, whatever property rights you have on that land, whatever benefit you can claim on that land, simply disappears during this year. It now belongs to everyone. And so in a sense, it really belongs to no one. And I understand the Sabbath year law much in the same way that I understand the Sabbath day law. You see, the people of Israel understood something about their relationship with the land. They understood, as they put it in one of their songs, that the earth is the Lord's, and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. Well, of course, that creates a problem. If the world, if the earth itself, all belongs to the Lord, well then how can you talk about anyone owning land. How can anyone own a piece of property? It belongs to God. And so what happened was that these people had to live, even though they know it wasn't true, they had to live day after day and year to year as if people could own land. Because they didn't have any other way to live. They had to organize their economy in such a way that land ownership was necessary. But they knew deep down that it wasn't really true. And so the Sabbath year was really about giving the land back to God, so that everyone now could benefit from it, including the wild animals. The Sabbath year was therefore about doing it right, doing it the way that God intended. 1 year out of 7. And this law is really, really important. So important that, as we read in Leviticus this morning, if they failed to do it, God told them the consequences would be dire. That God would not hesitate to kick them off the land altogether if they failed to keep the Sabbath year. That God would make sure the land got in rest, one way or another. So this Sabbath year law is that important. Today's Earth Day, as I'm sure you know. Today, one day out of 365. Actually, it's out of 366 this year. But one day, when we're supposed to do things differently, when we're supposed to bring a different attitude to our relationship with the earth, when we're supposed to think about how our lives might change to make things more sustainable on this planet. It's a good day. Good thing to do. But my question is, many people's question is it enough? 1 day out of 365. And of course it isn't. I mean, no matter how hard we work on this one day to, save our resources, to live lightly on the land, to reduce, to reuse, to recycle, whatever, it's only going to be a drop in the bucket compared to what's really needed. And then you might look at that and say, oh, well, what's the point? Why bother? What's one day going to do? Well, I think a birthday is kind of a modern Sabbath. Sure, it's only 1 day out of 365, but it's 1 day when we actually do it right. When we bring the attitudes that we really need to bring all the time. And no, we can't live like that all the time. At least not yet. I mean, it's not possible for us to carry around all the attitudes and the actions that should be with us on Earth Day throughout the year. But it's a Sabbath. It's about doing 1 day right in order to transform our attitude to the other days. It's a place to begin. And if we do a Sabbath right, it can have incredible power. And that's what it's about for me. But of course, when I think of it that way, it does bring me back to Leviticus and the warning that is there. The warning that is given that if a society fails to respect what God has given to it by giving rest, there will be consequences. And God does say that one way or the other, the land will have its rest, the waters will have their rest, the atmosphere will have its rest. The wild animals too. We need to think about how we take our Sabbath and how we let it influence us. For the earth will have its rest. Let's take a few moments.